Welcome to Are We Lantzmen, Exploring Our Shtetl Roots, with our special guest, Lisa Brahin, the author of a beautifully written and well-researched book, Tears Over Russia, A Search for Family and the Legacy of Ukraine's Pogroms. This is a subject that resonates with many of us who come from families that fled the pogroms in the Russian Empire, where until the 20th century, most of the world's Jews lived, over 5 million. Lisa's book tells the story of flight from the explosions of war, terror, and the pogroms against the Jews in Russia from the 1917 revolution, civil war, and the final communist takeover by 1922, a period in Jewish history second only in death and devastation to the Holocaust that came 20 years later. I want to tell you that this program is brought to you by Hadassah of Eastern Connecticut and the Jewish Federation of Eastern Connecticut. So for a quick welcome and hello, please welcome President Karen Blaustein of the Eastern Connecticut chapter of Hadassah. Karen.
And many names and faces.
Right.
Welcome to all of you. And Sheila had asked us to just quickly say a little bit about our own families. My family, actually both mothers and fathers came from an area called Grodno Gubernia, as far as I know. And I once asked one of my grandmothers, well, what country did you live in? And she said, well, they didn't claim us, so we didn't claim them. And fortunately for me to be here now, all of them left in the early 1900s before the Holocaust, although many of our other relatives passed away, but my immediate relatives made it here, obviously, because I'm here. And so welcome to you all.
Thank you. And now Rachel, the Executive Director of the Federation.
Hi, thank you so much for coming together on this cold, snowy night. When I spoke to Sheila a couple days ago, I said, I don't want to drive around the area on Tuesday night. And if I don't want to drive, I don't think anyone else will either. So I'm really glad we switched to Zoom. And now we're all on an equal playing field. So in my 2 minutes, I'm just going to share the patrilineal line of my family, because that's the line of my family that ended up in Norwich. So I wanted to share two stories. My great-grandmother Mary, or Miriam Turbowitz, was born in Warsaw, Poland in 1891. Her father, Jacob, was 21, and her mother, Nechama, was 23. She had two daughters with William Trubowitz, and then gave birth. One of those two daughters was my grandmother, Florence, who was born in 1916. When I was a young girl, I used to visit my great-grandmother, Mary Trubowitz, in her home, and she had a very strong Yiddish accent and loved serving me a big bowl of pasta covered in cottage cheese and sour cream. This is still my favorite comfort food. My great-grandmother taught herself English when she came to America in 1904 and settled in Norwich with her husband, William. She was best known for sitting down with the New York Times on Sunday and reading it from cover to cover. I have taken on this ritual, and everyone in my family knows to be quiet so I can read the New York Times. She passed away in 1981 in Salem, Massachusetts at the age of 90 and was buried in Norwich Hebrew Benevolent Association Cemetery. When my daughter was born, I named her Miriam after my great-grandmother, since she was our first great-great-grandchild from that lineage. 1 year after my grandmother's parents moved to Norwich, my grandfather's parents arrived from Poland, Reuben and Tessie Alexander. They were involved in Brothers of Joseph Synagogue, where my great-grandfather was a regular in the minyan. My father used to share stories with me about his time visiting his grandparents every weekend at Ocean Beach. Tessie and Reuben had 4 children, Roz, Gladys, Shirley, and Daniel Alexander. My grandfather, Daniel, was born in Norwich in 1913. He attended Brown University in 1935, and I was proud to follow in his footsteps. Reuben never learned English, so Tessie ran the La France shop in Norwich. When my parents were planning their wedding, my great-grandmother Tessie was happy to provide my mother, Sheila, with a gorgeous wedding gown from her La France shop. Tessie was buried in 1955 at Brothers of Joseph Cemetery in Preston. And here we are today, 4 generations later. So it's an honor to be with all of you.
Okay, thank you so much, Rachel. So many people helped us get to this day. So before we get to our Supreme Speaker, let me just thank first Rabbi Mark Ekstrand. I don't know if you're here, Rabbi, but you volunteered the temple as our venue for tonight. Hopefully the next time we'll be in person, but it's nice to see everyone on Zoom. We want to thank Sophia Gipstein for her artistry in designing our flyers. Thank you, Marcia Reinhardt and Nathaniel Rowe for our Zoom masters. Our committee, Ellis Sackett, Ron Lisa, Leslie Spees, Roz Etra, Martin Rutchick, and Rachel Levy. And because we want to have an interactive session to do the kind of thing Rachel just did, to talk about what you know about your family's history with the help of Lisa, we had some people send us information. I want to recognize those people who gave us their stories, a little bit of them. Ron Lisa, Hallie Keeler, Martin Rutchick, Frank Himmelstein, Karen Blaustein, Rachel Levy, and 2 other people that are related to me and my husband. So interestingly, Leslie Spees, my cousin on my husband Vic's mother's Winsburg side. She's our family genealogist and historian. And another cousin, Charlie Bax. I see Charlie is here, who's from Providence and Fort Myers. And he is a cousin on Vic's paternal side, on the Horvitz side, and very interested in family history. So it's nice to have family here as well. So now let me get to my introduction of Lisa Brahin. And my connection to Lisa's book is the inspiration for this program, no doubt about it. And I have to tell you why. My mother and grandmother and aunt fled the Shtetl, Stavisht in Ukraine in 1921, arrived in Ellis Island in 1923. I have been writing my family history in Yiddish and in English, and I'm always searching for more information. Growing up, probably like many of your experiences, our families didn't share a lot about their lives in Europe. They didn't want to relive the pain, perhaps. And besides, my grandmother would always say to us, we were strangers in a strange land. We were never welcome in Russia. It was just one of the way stations in the journey of the Jewish diaspora. So when I came across a book written by a Jewish genealogist in New Jersey about her family's flight from Ukraine between 1921 and 1923, from the same shtetl as my mother and my grandmother and my aunt, I was so excited. It was my family's story. It was my story. I had to reach her. That very second, miraculously, I looked up a phone number by her name on the free white pages of New Jersey. I found this landline. I called it, and this woman immediately answered. It was Lisa. She was wondering, why was she getting a call on a landline that no one used? And we've been talking to each other ever since. So let me say, Lisa, it's time for you to say hi now. I want to introduce you as an accomplished Jewish genealogist and researcher from New Jersey, a graduate of the George Washington University Columbian College, a 2-town project coordinator for JewishGen.org's Yisker Book Project, which is a Holocaust memorial book project. Lisa hopes that her book will inspire continued interest in family history research. She also hopes that it will shine a light on an underrepresented period of Jewish history, the 1917 to 1921 pogroms in Ukraine that prefigure the horror that was to come. Lisa, I'm so glad that you're here.
Thank you, Sheila. Thank you for the introduction. And I'm so excited that you found me, Sheila.
Oh, it was great. So my first question to you is, how do you feel? How much satisfaction do you get when your work inspires people like me and other people to connect with their roots?
Well, I'm absolutely thrilled. That's really the bottom line. That's what it's all about. I feel this deep passion that we must record our history, especially for the future. We must do it now. And when I hear from people asking questions and needing help, that's what I love to see. I like to see, it doesn't matter how old you are. If you're a young person, I just want to encourage the young people like I did. I was a young girl at the time when I started. This was over 50 years ago when I started. And if you're an older person, I think that write down what you know. Sometimes even just a kernel of truth can be a really good clue. And somebody's going to be looking for that in the future, because when I went looking and other people were trying to help me, they went looking for, you know, compositions that their grandmothers wrote, old tapes, stories, anything that recorded the past, because as we go further along in time, it's going to be a lot harder. So I have to say, Alex Haley was the one with roots in the 1970s that truly inspired me. I had already heard my grandmother's stories. I was still a young girl, but I started to think, who do I know? I mean, my only immigrant grandparent was my grandmother Hannah. And so I went back to her and I said, Grandma, I want to tape record. I want to record it like Alex Haley recorded his story. So I think it's really important. Also working on family trees, if you're interested in that, it does bring lost wings together. Like when I did my grandfather's side, wings that he knew, the children and grandchildren of his cousins, and I'm still in contact with them. Everybody, when there's a project involved, gets excited about it. And I just feel that it's so important to record history. And I'm so happy that people are inspired by my book.
Great. I just want to remind everybody, as Lisa gives her talk, we want you to put any questions you have in the chat addressed to me, Sheila. Address them to me so I'll be able to see them, and we'll ask the questions after Lisa's done with her presentation. All right, Lisa, before we get to all of the slides, one more point. You and I were just talking earlier today, the significance, it's the 100th anniversary of our family arriving in Ellis Island. Our family arrived the same day in December of 1923. So it's not quite 100 years yet, but almost, right?
Almost there. We're almost there, Sheila.
The same year.
100 years of liberty.
Right. All right, let's set the stage and the context for your story. Marcia, show us the very first slide. We want to show you this because this was the Pale of Settlement. The Pale of Settlement was something devised in 1791 by Catherine the Great. It lasted until 1917. It was a decree that Jews could only live within those areas of the Russian Empire. And only with a few exceptions, they were forbidden from living in the cities. So that's why the Jews were forced to move to the small provincial towns, hence the Shtetls, the small towns. What are the places in there? It's the Belarus, Ukraine, Poland, parts of Latvia, Lithuania. That makes up most of the places in the Pale. Let's look at the second map. Marcia, that's it. Can you go down a little further on that map? There you go. So, Lisa, I want you to comment on this map. I see Kiev in the,
right.
in the top central. Yeah,
that's up towards the top there. You'll see Belitserka, which is just below Kiev. That's a major city. That's a part of my book, quite a number of chapters. And below Belitserka would be where Stavist is, about 30 miles south. We also see, I think, the Dniester River. We're going to talk about that. Kishinev, and then of course, we wanted to show you on the bottom left there, on the water side, Constanza. That's the port where a lot of Ukrainian, right there, that's where a lot of the Ukrainian Jews, both Sheila's family and my family left from Constanza. So that's where it all began for us.
right. And we wanted to say that what you see is Chisinau is Kishinev.
It's Kishinev. That's how my grandmother and her cousins said it, pronounced it.
Right. And you'll talk about it also, but I know that my mother, my grandmother, my aunt spent about almost 2 years, perhaps from 1921 to 1923, probably in Kishinev,
They were all in
awaiting
Kishinev.
passage. Mhm.
All
We'll
of the
talk about that.
Stavish Jews, I believe that I know of, were in the Kishinev area, and we were stranded there because we didn't have the passports.
Exactly. It took a while to be sponsored by people in
Yes.
America to be able to get passage.
And there were quotas as well, so we
Right.
were sort of stuck there.
Right, and just north of the Kishinev, Chisinau is the Dniester River, which
Mhm.
forms the border between Ukraine and Romania, which is
Right.
what they had to forge, what they had to go over in secret without being caught by the authorities, and you're going to talk about
Absolutely.
that. So this is
And-
an important map, so I'm glad we
Right.
have that. And now, Marcia, keep going. We have a few photos.
I think there's one more map.
Yeah,
Yeah.
here's another map, the next slide. This is
I-
what we can see Kiev, and if you can see on the, keep going down, Marcia, further down is Stavish. Can you see Stavish? There it is
Stavish
at the
is-
very,
yeah, it's above Zashkov on the bottom there. By the way, Zashkov, right beneath Stavish, is where Moshe Dayan's family came from. They were related to the rabbi of Stavish. But if you look all the way up towards the top, you'll see Boyarka. It's way up on the top. Yeah, there. That was the role model for Sholem Aleichem's Anatevka. So it's really close. This is what Stavish was like, what we saw in Fiddler on the Roof. That was about 12 years before my book began, the time period, Fiddler on the Roof. But Boyarka was a shtetl, quite like Stavish.
okay.
We also
And now-
see Tetiev. I just wanted to mention Tetiev before we go on the bottom left there. When my family fled from Ukraine, they passed through Tetiev, and that was perhaps the greatest, unfortunately, the greatest massacre of Jews, I believe, was in that town, and they saw the remains.
Yeah. Okay, and now we have a few photographs of Stavish. So keep going down. That looks like the typical shtetl architecture in a way. If you've been to the Yiddish Book Center in Amherst, Massachusetts, their architecture was somewhat modeled on this Yiddish shtetl building. Keep going. And what can you say about this photograph?
Well, this is obviously a shoemaker or a bootmaker. It wasn't my great-grandfather's shop. This is from about 1890, but it was a Jewish shop. And it hangs, this photograph, I believe, hangs in, there's a little Stavish museum in Stavish. And it's just a typical looking, I find it fascinating, actually. Look at the boots.
Yeah. Next one. Marcia, yeah, there you go.
So this is 1923. This is right after the pogroms. These photos were sent to the JDC Bureau seeking help. I believe that either one or both of these buildings they used to be synagogues. There were 6 synagogues in Stavish, 3 were burned. And they're showing sort of the remnants of what's left. And when the Jews who didn't flee went back to Stavish, 10 to 12 families partitioned areas within each of these buildings because there were no homes left. Their homes were either torched or they were taken over by the peasants, and they didn't have a home to go back to. So this is sort of a photo that was sent asking for help.
Okay, great. All right, and now the stage is all of yours for the rest of your slideshow. There you go.
This is the cover of my book, and you'll notice that there's both Russia and Ukraine in the title. That seems to be confusing to a lot of my friends. But what I tell them is Stavish, when my grandmother was born in 1912, was a part of the Russian Empire. And by the time in her later childhood, when the pogroms began, it was a part of Ukraine. So the borders kept changing. It's very difficult when people are doing research on their roots. A lot of times they'll still consider this Russia, but really during the time period of the massacres, the pogroms, it did become Ukraine. So we can go on to the next photo. So this is the most important photograph in my Jewish genealogical journey. The little baby is my grandmother Hannah in America. She was called Anne. And next to her is my beautiful ancestor, her mother, my great-grandmother. Her name was Rebecca Cutler Caprove. Both of them are major characters in my book. And this was taken in Stavisht around 1912 because Grandma was just an infant at this picture. They survived in Stavisht a horrible massacre, and it wasn't just one. It was over a period of years from 1917 to 1921, anti-Jewish riots and massacres. I call it a genocide. We had in Ukraine about over 100,000 to nearly 250,000 people, Jewish civilians, were murdered, and they were right in the heart of it. They fled for their lives. If you take a close look, maybe you'll be able to see the water damage on this photograph. There are white circular dots on it. When my family was fleeing in 1920, they were trying to flee over the Dniester River, which we had mentioned at that time in history was the border of Ukraine going into Romania. Romania didn't want the Jewish refugees. So it was a dangerous task. They piled in a rowboat and they went out. They were rowing during the changing of the guards because if they got caught, they would be shot at. And when they got halfway out, the rowboat sank and it filled up with water. They were thrown out. Luckily, the adults could still stand. They held the children up. But as they did that, the photographs, they fell into the Dniester River. And this is one of the photographs that they fished out. They literally were fishing it out with the threat of these guards shooting at them. So I have no idea how many actually remained in the river, but because they were able to save this one, it's very dear to me. Now, I knew my great-grandmother, Rebecca. I was 9 years old when she passed away, and I used to visit her, and she had this photograph. It was propped up on a shelf in her apartment, and when the grown-ups were cleaning up her apartment, they were cleaning it out after she died, I was there, and I saw the photograph, and I stole it. I felt like I had to have it because when I saw it, there was something with this photograph. I was so enamored by it, but it ignited within me what began a lifetime desire to know every detail of their past. Because if you look at the photograph, you can see that another world really came before mine. Rebecca died in July of 1972. And 50 years later, her picture graces the cover of my book. You can go on to the next photograph. This is also another photograph of Rebecca and Hannah, obviously a year or two later, because we can see Hannah's a little bit older, taken in Stavisht. This also went into the Dniester. It was in such bad shape, I never thought I'd show it to anybody. And then a genealogist who was a specialist in restoring old photographs restored the photograph and he colorized it. And I looked at it, I said, my God, it's so beautiful. You can see how beautiful they were. Rebecca was a seamstress, and you notice that the lace on her dress matches the lace on Hannah's dress. And they look just beautiful there. We could go on to the next one. This is my great-grandfather, Isaac Caprove. He was Hannah's father and Rebecca's husband. And here he is in the Tsar's army. It was taken around the year that my grandmother was born because she didn't see him for the first few years of his life. So this is an interesting thing that I found. If you had an ancestor that was a soldier in the Tsar's army during the First World War, and if he was killed or wounded with discharge papers, they have documents on them. Now, I know right now I don't think the Russian website would be up and running, but this was a number of years ago, and they found documents on Isaac, and from that, it confirmed what my grandmother said. He was sent from Ukraine all the way up to Siberia. He was so far away that he could stand by the Amur River and see the shores of China. We can go on to the next photo. This is Isaac Kaprov, again on the right, the handsome fella who's a little bit taller, in his clothing, not in his military outfit, in his normal clothing. He came back, he was discharged, he was wounded, he was shot in the legs, and he was a shoemaker. He was a shoemaker in Stavisht, and he opened up a shoe shop and was doing quite well. And then in 1919, there was a horrible pogrom in Stavish. So he and his wife, Rebecca, they were out in a back courtyard, unaware that a pogrom was beginning. And my grandmother, Hannah, and her baby sister, Sunny, they were 3 and 6 years old. They were in one of the back rooms of the shoe shop. They lived in the back rooms. They shared a bed. They were little girls. And all of a sudden a pogrom broke out, and Rebecca says to Isaac, if we go back to try to save them, they were right there, the pogrom bandits, they would follow them, and they were afraid that they would all be killed. They would be leading them to the children. So they hid in a root cellar that night, a horrible night, if you can imagine being separated from your daughters. And when they went back in the morning, they found their daughters fine. They were asleep in their beds and nothing had been touched. Now, the whole street had been destroyed, basically, looted. And what happened was Zhelezhnek, who was one of the white guards, his soldiers were attacking Stavisht, and they were joined by the local peasantries, the local peasants, the local bandits who were also looting. They were killing. They were walking with axes. They were axing down the doors, and they were crashing, smashing the windows right on my grandmother's street. And the head bandit, he stopped them. His name was Vasil, and he says, "Nobody's going into the shoe shop. This man fed me and my daughter when we were hungry. He taught me everything he knows about being a shoemaker. This is where I work. We're not going to go into this house. We're going to kill some other Jews." And they passed over. It's like that Passover story. They literally passed over the house. And it was a miracle that my grandmother and her sister Sunny weren't murdered. But that brings us to the next photograph. And if we could just lift that up just a little bit. What is that? It's a Hebrew list. And those of us who know how to read Hebrew, we read from right to left. So we see a list of names, and they're followed by the ages of the people. This is a death list. They call this a tombstone list. And what's important about this particular list is these are the people that died the night of that pogrom. These are 19, there were 30 people that were murdered. And these are 19 of the people that lived right on their street and their surrounding streets that were murdered. So where did I get this list? I had heard that it was in an archive. It was lost nobody looked at it for maybe 70 years. And I had all these archivists in Israel searching for it. Someone had come across it several years before I started looking. This was in 2003. So maybe around 2000, there was a gentleman who had seen it, then he forgot where it was. Well, it took an entire summer, and the manuscript was found. It was written by Eliezer David Rosenthal, who was a friend of the Jewish poet and writer Chaim Bialik. An interesting fact about this, Emma Goldman, the Jewish anarchist who was deported from the United States in 1919, she landed in Odessa when they sent her back to what she called Russia. It was actually Ukraine in those years. And she wrote a memoir of her time there. And she writes, there's a passage in her memoir. She says, "I met Chaim Bialik And who did he have with him? A quote unquote literary investigator who was collecting all of these papers and information on more than 70 cities of where the pogroms were in the area. She never named Rosenthal, but when I read her memoir, I knew it was Rosenthal. So the two men, Bialik and Rosenthal, they tried to publish part of the manuscript, but both of the men died in the early 1930s. And the remainder of the manuscript was never published because they had died. And Rosenthal's grandsons, they gave it to an archive, and it sat unread. And the pages that were not published included my Shtetl, Stavisht. And so this was a fascinating find. When they eventually found it, it took 3 months. It was falling apart. The library, the National Library of Israel, had a restoration project done, and it took like a year. They restored this, quite a manuscript, and it's now in Genesim Archive in Israel. We could go on to the next. So you may wonder, why do I have it is kind of a blurry photo to use in a presentation, but this is a murder victim, Elik Stepansky from Stavisht. He was a blacksmith, and 3 of my grandmother's young cousins during General Denikin's raid of the town. This was yet another pogrom that came after Zhelezhnek's. They looked through a window. They were young kids running around town, and they witnessed his murder. And they were also related to him. He was a cousin of theirs. Later that night, his infant son, his younger brother, and his grandmother were brutally murdered. His widow and 2 of his children fled to Argentina. And several years ago, I found his granddaughter in Buenos Aires, and she gave me, this is all she had of her grandfather. And because I have this scene in my book, I wanted to honor Elik by using his photograph. Unfortunately, his granddaughter passed away during the pandemic, but she was so excited. I'm glad that I used it. And we can go on to the next photograph. Well, we're up to the heroes. This is one of the heroes. This is Rabbi Pitzi Avram, the rabbi of Stavisht. He's on the right there with the white beard, and he is seen here with his son Nissan and his wife Sarah. Nissan, just a quick side note, was the father of the great scientist from France, Moshe Hazinski. He was one of the founders of radiochemistry, and he was Marie Curie's lab partner. As a matter of fact, Rabbi Pitzi Avram, that's a nickname. His last name was Hazinski, or Gaysinski, he used in America. He was the grandfather of a brilliant scientist. Another one of his grandsons, his youngest one, was a very close friend of mine. So the story with Rabbi Pitzi Avram, he was the brilliant rabbi of Stavisht, and he felt like God was always looking over him, and in return, it was his responsibility to save and look after the Jews of Stavisht, which was really a hard thing to do during the time of the pogroms. But he took that seriously. He had this special bright light within inside him. He was brave. He was a brilliant negotiator. He was multilingual. And how did he do it? Every time there was a major pogrom in Stavisht, he threw himself in harm's way, and he went in front of the bandit leaders and he would say, "Take me to your leader." And they did. And he would negotiate with the leaders, and they actually respected him. They never saw anything like it before. Of course, they were looters, and he collected ransoms for them. But over the course of the several years of the pogroms, and there were 10 major pogroms in Stavisht, 160 people from Stavisht were murdered. That actually isn't considered a lot when you compare all the other shtetls and towns and all of the murders going on there. 4,000 Jews were saved by Rabbi Pitzi Avram. Sheila, your family and my family were saved by this man's bravery. Our families fled because he put himself in harm's way. After the bandits would leave, and I found this to be repetitive because I did so much research on all of the pogroms in this area. Once they would leave Stavisht, they weren't so fond of the other rabbis in the other towns, and they would go in and murder them and commit mass murders. But Rabbi Pitzi Avram certainly was a bright light and a hero in this story. We could go on. And we could just lift that just a little bit. This is a picture of the Stavisht Torah crown. So in 1920, we had 6 synagogues in Stavisht. 3 of them were torched by pogrom bandits. And while one of them was burning, Rabbi Pitzi Avram ran into the synagogue and he opened the ark for the last time. And he took out the Torah from that synagogue and 2 Torah crowns. And this one of the 2 crowns, his grandson and I found in a North Jersey synagogue in the year 2005. I believe it to be the only antique relic from the Jewish period of Stavisht that I could find. I don't know if there's any other ones that survived, but we could go on to the next slide. This is just a quick mention of Cantor David Yosel Moser of Stavisht. He was in one of the burning synagogues. The Rabbi Pitzi Avram didn't know he was passing a synagogue where David Yosel was in. And David was reading the Torah and bandits came in and they defiled the Torah and they torched it. And it became too much for him and he had a heart attack and he dropped to the floor and he died beside the burning Torah in Stavisht, just as the rabbi is fleeing with one of the other Torahs. We can go on to the next. This is, you can lift that up a little bit, Itzi Stumacher's house in Belatzerka. So what happened was every time there was a major pogrom in Stavisht, the Jews got up and they walked to Belatzerka, which means white church. It's nearly 30 miles north. A lot of them went on foot. They felt it was safer because it was a bigger city. And Molly, who was the sister of my great-grandmother, Rebecca, Molly Cutler, married Itzi Stumacher, and this was considered quite a nice house in its time. I'm amazed that I was able to find a photograph. You'll notice there are 2 doors. They had a rental apartment in that second door, and that's where my family stayed when they fled Stavisht and they went to Belatzerka. Unfortunately, that is also the scene of where my grandmother's baby sister starved to death. Her mother had typhus. She was very ill in that room right there behind the window, and the baby died. But this is an unusual photograph of Itzi's house, and I wanted to include that. We could go on to the following slide. Okay, so this gentleman is another hero. This is absolutely the wildest story in my book. This guy was a wild guy. There was something about him. There was something inside this man that allowed him to do something absolutely miraculous. So who was he? His name was Barney Stumacher, and he was a cousin of Itzi Stumacher, who was married to Molly, whose house we just saw in Belatzerka. But Barney was already in America. He served in World War I as an American soldier. He was living in New York, and he receives a letter from his father, who was living in Belatzerka. And the father writes to him and says to him, if you don't come save us from these pogroms, we're all going to die. So what did Barney do? He did what any good son would do. He got himself a passport and he went on a ship and he went back to try to save his mother and father and 3 sisters in Belatzerka. And all the Jews were trying to flee Belatzerka and Ukraine, and he was basically the only Jew trying to get in. So now I'm going to take you to a parallel story. Oh, by the way, and the letters and all the correspondence is in my book. The letter from Barney's father describing what was happening in Belatzerka. But the parallel story has to do with actor Dustin Hoffman. he went on Finding Your Roots back, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years ago, to learn about his family and his Jewish roots. And although Dustin Hoffman's story is not a part of my book, what his grandfather Frank Hoffman went through is identical almost, at least the beginning of the story, to what Barney Stumacher went through. So Frank Hoffman was a young man with 4 children living in Chicago. He had immigrated from Bella Cerca, and he receives a letter from his father telling him, please come save us. So all of a sudden, there was no mail for all these years. I did a lot of research on this. I'm wondering if, I know from Barney, the letter Barney received was snuck out by an American who was passing through Bella Cerca because there was no mail. I'm wondering if that same American got the letter to Frank Hoffman in Chicago, because the 2 gentlemen received the letter in the same month, in August of 1920. So Frank Hoffman decides he's going to do what Barney's going to do. He's going to go back to Ukraine and save his parents. So they're on different ships, but they left within 2 weeks of each other. I did research on that. So it's incredible that we have 2 men now. So Frank goes back to Ukraine, just like Barney did, and Frank is arrested by the Bolsheviks and he is executed. Then his father, Frank's father, which was Dustin Hoffman's great-grandfather, goes looking for his son. He's arrested and he is executed. Then his great-grandmother, Dustin's great-grandmother, goes looking for her husband and her son, and she's thrown in prison. So their story had a horrible ending. Dustin's father was one of the children left in Chicago with the mother. And I guess they moved away to get away from, it was painful and sad, and Dustin didn't know this story. Well, let's go back to Barney Stumacher's story. He sneaks into Ukraine, and Barney's arrested, and he's about to be executed. And what happens? He has such charisma, and people really pulled for him. Strangers helped him, and a couple of the soldiers helped him, and he got out of it. He was not executed, and he went through all kinds of wild stories. I mean, there was a train crash, there was everything. I can't even begin to tell you. There's so many stories in the book. And he lands on his feet on its Yom Kippur evening in 1920 in September. And he wanders into Bella Cerca to save his family. As he's wandering by foot, everybody comes out to see. My grandmother was there. They came out of that house that I just showed you. They all gathered around. It was like Elijah the prophet, entered Bella Cerca to come and save them. So he tells his mother, he says, I'm here to save you. I'm bringing you back to America. And what does his mother say? Okay, well, you're going to bring 50 or 60 of our nearest and dearest friends, because we're all getting out of here. And well, that wasn't good enough, because Molly, remember Molly who married Itzy, his cousin, and owned the house, she says to her husband, we're not leaving unless if you bring my entire family, the Cutlers and the Capros. Now that included my family, including my grandmother. So Barney, he went back to save 5 people, and he ended up with 80 people. And they left Bella Cerca. He led the way. 200-mile trek from Bella Cerca all the way down to the Dniester that we had just mentioned. And they all split up and went in different rowboats. We all know what happened to my grandmother's rowboat. But eventually they all got over the Dniester. Barney and his group of 50, I think it was 58 people, went on. They had passports. They went on to America. And my grandmother and 20 of her closer relatives were left behind, just like Sheila's family. They were left behind a few years in Romania. So before we go on to the next photo, I do want to say one thing about Barney Stumacher. Before he received that letter from his father to come save everybody, Barney led a very quiet and uneventful life. And after he came back from Europe, after saving 80 people, he led a very quiet and uneventful life for the rest of his life. But that one year from 1920 to 1921, this man was absolutely spectacular. I have never heard a story like it. My family lived and survived because of Barney Stumacher, and I want him to be remembered. So we can go on to the next picture. This is the Braga. It's a picture postcard of my grandmother's ship. Now, she was stranded because of the quotas in Romania until 1923. You'll notice that her father bought the postcard. He wrote his name, it's scribbled across in Russian, Isaac Kaprov. He didn't have a stamp, which was a good thing because now I'm the proud recipient of the original postcard because it was never mailed. So what happened that was unusual with the Braga? It's August 31st of 1923. We have four ships that are hovering around the waters of Ellis Island. Now, there are quotas, there are monthly quotas, meaning America says only a certain amount of people from a certain amount of countries can immigrate, and they broke it down into a monthly quota. If your quota in that month was filled, they send you back to wherever you came from. So the most desirable time to come in would be the first day of the month, and the worst time, because the quota probably was filled, would be the very last day of the month. So we have four ships, and they're all hovering around this imaginary line. And one of the ships decides to make a run for it, and they go in over the line, and all the other ships followed. That included the Braga, and we could go to the next photo. Okay, this is the Byron, one of the other ships. This is where Sheila's mother and grandmother were on the Byron, but not only were they on the Byron, but 6 of my grandmother's family, the Cutler relatives that are in my book, were also on the Byron. So all 4 ships crossed the imaginary line. They were clocked in by the Ellis Island Observer before midnight instead of after midnight. So they were technically clocked in as August the 31st. And they were bound to go back. That's what the newspapers, the New York Times, now my grandmother didn't know this, so I don't know how much they really told, if anything, to the passengers. But on the front page of the New York Times, it says these aliens, their ships came in too soon to enter. Over 1,800 are probably going to have to go back. And there was a lot of debate in this country, in the United States. Should we let them stay? Should we send them back? And thank God, the United States decided that they could stay. This is my lucky story. Sheila, this is your lucky story, your lucky
Right.
genealogical story. If our families were sent back, and let me tell you, they almost were by my ship, my grandma's ship, 4 minutes too early. Yours was 3 minutes too early. I looked that up. I don't think either of us or our families would be here today. So
Wow.
we can go on to the next. Okay, this is interesting. This is a passenger record. I don't know how well you can see the names, but what made this so special to me is on the top 6 are my Cutler family. These are my grandmother's uncle, Yunkel, who's named Jacob on the passenger record, Esther, his wife, who was the daughter of that cantor who died in the synagogue. There are 4 children. We have Daniel and Sarah have pretty prominent roles in my book. They're all on this passenger list, and look who's on the bottom. We go all the way to the bottom. The last 2 names, well, Zevenitska, that's Sheila's mother and Sheila's grandmother. They're
Right.
in line together on the same ship. They pulled in the same day. My grandmother was on a ship right next to them, and they're all going through this. They're together. They certainly knew. This is my proof that they knew each other. They had to have known each other. And it's miraculous that we can see this, that Sheila
Right.
and I found each other. How many years later? Almost 100?
Almost 100. Well, yeah.
Almost 100.
But my grandmother and my mother were accompanied by my grandmother's sister, Ruth, and we're still looking for her. We don't know if she came over with them from Constanza, from Romania, or whether she came separately.
We'll find her. Give me some time, Sheila.
Okay,
I'm gonna make
that's-
that my next mission.
That's right.
Let's go on to the next photograph now. This is my family that I write about in my book. My grandmother Hannah is the oldest daughter in the middle there. Right below her is Sunny, her sister, her baby brother Beryl. That's Isaac and Rebecca, her parents. They all look rather thin there, and a cousin remarked to me that she thought they looked terrified. If you look at the looks, except for the baby who didn't really know what was going on, they've been through a lot, and you can see that. So I say, I took this from Fiddler, soon I'll be a stranger in a strange new place, searching for an old familiar face, because how apropos. The only silver lining, I would say, the horror that they went through, they survived, and because of that, they weren't in Stavish during the Holocaust. So we can go on to the next photo. This is the family in New York City. This is Bessie Cutler's wedding. So Bessie is a sister to both Molly and Rebecca. She's the beautiful lady in the center back row. This is actually her second marriage, her second wedding. This is in New York after everybody arrived. There's a chapter on Bessie. She's a main character in my book. She lived in another shtetl called Sokolovka Ustengrad, which was right near Stavisht. They had two major pogroms, a summer and a winter pogrom. Her first husband was caught up and murdered in the winter pogrom, and she went to find him, and she found him face up on a wagon. 200 men were murdered, all by the river. She had a baby, and the baby died. So she really lost everything in Ukraine. So this is her new life. If we go over to the left side of the photograph, we see three children. The oldest child, yes, the oldest one in the back, that's Hannah, my grandmother. And the two children in front of her are her brother Beryl and her sister Sunny. And we can go on to the next one. So this is my grandmother Hannah. She looks a little older because she's tall. She's in her teens in this picture, in the roaring 20s. In America, she lived at first in Brooklyn and then Philadelphia. So what was life like for her in America? My family was very grateful to be free and to live in peace and to have liberty. But it was tough. The first years were tough. She was of the younger generation, but her parents, Isaac and Rebecca, never learned English, and they lived in poverty because they struggled to make a living. And she was very bright. She learned English immediately. She refused to speak the old country, the Russian. She wouldn't teach me Russian, but I know that she knew how to speak Russian. She only wanted to be an American. But when she was 14 years old, she left school, and her teachers begged her not to leave school. But she went to work in a garment industry, in a garment factory, because they needed her to work, because they needed to eat. And this is the kind of, I think with all of our ancestors, or most of our ancestors, these are the sacrifices that the early generations made. But now as time goes on, I'm 2 generations removed, we have a better life because of them. We're educated, or we're able to get educated if we want to be. We have better jobs, we have freedom, we just have a better life. And I owe that to my grandmother. I think we all owe that to our early ancestors. We can go on. This is my grandmother, Hannah Ann. and my grandfather, Ben. They're at Sonny's wedding, and I wanted to put that in so you can see I love this photograph. But she did suffer, you know, she survived a massacre in Stavish, and she was always anxious. She suffered from claustrophobia. You'll see that as a repetitive theme in my book. Agoraphobia, as people were fleeing Stavish, she was caught up in the crowds. But she had a happy life, I think, overall. But she didn't talk about it. She never spoke about it, what happened to her, to my mother. It was very painful. It took 2 generations to get the information out of her. And it wasn't easy because she had anxiety every time she went to speak about it. But we can go on to the next photograph. This one's my favorite. This is my wedding. That's me with my grandmother almost 40 years ago. And I felt I had to have that photograph in my book because it is the most meaningful photograph I have of me with my grandmother, Hannah. We can go on. Now, this is an odd thing that I found. It's a little, I put it out of order, but what it meant to me, this is actually the first anti-Semitic thing against the Jews that I found in my research towards the beginning of my book. If you look at this, it looks like there's names, almost like you would see in a census, but it's not a census. This is actually, we started out, Sheila started telling us about the Pale of Settlement and the restrictions against the Jews. Well, 90 years after the Pale of Settlement, we had the May laws from the Tsar, and he further restricted where Jews could live. So this is my family, the Cutler side. This is Rebecca with her parents and some of her siblings. It stops in 1893 with the last name because I know that's when the last, there were 2 other siblings born afterwards, but this is from 1882 to 1893, a book that actually wrote them up as living illegally in the countryside right outside of Stavish. So they were dragged into court quite a few times from what I could gather. So this was sort of a prelude to the pogroms. And then I go ahead and I say that the pogroms were a prelude to the Holocaust. So we can go on to the next picture. So before I speak about this article, I just wanted to read something, a very short passage. It probably would have been a little bit more interesting. It was originally in Yiddish. I think Sheila would have enjoyed the Yiddish, but my grandmother translated it for me, and this is what her mother said. "We always had trouble and we still have it. The way it looks, we'll always have it. They don't let us Jews live. Wherever we go, they knock us. They let us live for a while, and before you know it, another one, some type of a pogrom, comes along." So this was spoken by my great-grandmother, Rebecca, in 1920 in a courtroom in Kishinev when they were dragged as refugees into a Kishinev courtroom because the Romanians didn't want them there. And it was really the first meltdown and only meltdown that my grandmother witnessed. And all I can say is this is 1920, and she saw the prelude of the horror that was to come. Now, the photograph that we see here, yes, the colorful one there, that's from an article that I wrote in the Jewish Book Council, and it does give tips on those digging into their family's roots and why you should chase history. Again, I just wanted to encourage everybody to write down whatever it is that you learn because it's so important. Next, we have the sources. So I don't know, Sheila, did you want to come in?
No, well, thank you for this. Yeah, we're going to talk about that. Just two comments I have about Rabbi Pitzi Avram. Some I learned from you and what I learned myself.
Oh,
This man, the hero that saved, as you said, thousands of the Stavista Jews, where many other shtetls around Stavish were not as lucky.
mm-hmm.
He eventually fled himself. He started off in London, and then he came to America and he became the rabbi of a synagogue in the Bronx.
Mm-hmm.
And after all of that heroic life and everything he did, He died crossing the street from his synagogue to his house in the Bronx, getting run over by a car. Isn't that unbelievable? After that heroic life. That's one part. The other part is my brother and I visiting the cemeteries of our great uncle and aunt who are buried in the Stavishta Benevolent Association Cemetery in Queens, New York. And we visited there just a few weeks before I came in contact with you, Lisa, and I found out that Rabbi Pitzi Amram is buried right next to
Yes,
my
he's by
aunt
the
and
gate.
uncle.
Did you see right by the gate there? On
Right
the
by
right
the
of
gate, right, well.
Yes, there's a picture of his headstone. It was quite a headstone, the writing on it.
Well, we missed it. Of
Mhm.
course, the Stavishta entrance, the big stone entrance
Right.
has the names of the people who are the leaders of the benevolent community. But now we have to go back and look at Rabbi Pitzi Avram's grave. All right.
Yeah.
we
Sheila,
want you-
question.
yes.
Do you know what synagogue in the Bronx he was part of? He was the
Ooh, I
rabbi
can-
for?
Not offhand, but I can let you know. It
It's
was,
in it is in my book.
Is it in the book?
It was
Okay.
by Fox Street, and he actually took the Torah and the two crowns with him. He used them in that synagogue, but after he passed away, he was hit by a taxi cab.
Unbelievable.
The synagogue closed, and
Wow.
the Torah was given away, so I don't want anybody to worry about that. It was given to a Jewish group, but his grandson and I were not able to determine where, and we could only find the one Torah crown, and it is in an ark of a synagogue in New Jersey. But quite a man, Sheila, quite a man.
Really amazing. So as we end our talk with you, we want to let everyone know that we're thinking of having another program with you that will be more interactive, where people can do the research on their families, and like some of you have already done, send us information and talk to Lisa, get more hints about how to find out more about your family's roots. So in preparation for that, Lisa, why don't you give us a little bit of information about
Okay.
the resources that we could use?
These are all my favorite resources. Before I begin, I actually had forgotten one that is important if you have ancestors from Poland, but we had a few people speak at the beginning who had family in Galicia, Vilna, Grodno. Part of my family comes from Volhynia. Sometimes those records overlap because the borders keep changing. It's called JRI Poland, Jewish Records Indexing Poland. It's free. You can search. A lot of the records are indexed. Some actually have the Polish records attached to them. It's amazing. I've helped other people. I don't really have many ancestors from Poland, but I have used it, and I think it's a wonderful site. But to start with, my favorite one is jewishgen.org. I am involved with two towns for two projects. One is the Yisker Book Project, and I'm sure Sheila will want to talk a little bit about that at another time. Those are Holocaust memorial books that we're having translated so that people can, it has the history of the town. So if you have a town that you're interested in, you can go over on Jewish Gen and look. Also key on that, there's many databases, but there's a family finder, and there's also a way to search towns. So you can reach out to other researchers of those towns. Ancestry.com, that is a paid site, but it's well worth it. I like to just use the US records. That's just me. But it's a wonderful site. It has everything on it. Family Search is, I believe that's a free site. The Center for Jewish History has some wonderful programs, and they are associated with YIVO. And by the way, many archives help me. There was nothing when I went looking to, I wanted to read about what my grandmother's story was, somebody else's story that was like hers. And I really couldn't find any. I couldn't find any family stories. And I reached out to archivists all around the world, and YIVO was one of the archives, and they do have an archive, Cherikover archive on pogroms. And I also, by the way, interviewed a lot of people. So if you're able to interview people to help you with your research, that's wonderful. ItalianGen.org. Why am I mentioning Italian Gen? It's not Italian records, but the Italian genealogy group was very devoted to indexing New York City's genealogical databases. And guess what? It's free. So if you go on there, it's up to a certain year. They don't have the more recent ones, but you can really navigate brides, index, grooms, birth, death, before a certain year. So that's worth looking at if you have, because most of the Jewish people that entered the country, a good majority, at first at least, lived in the New York City area. Yad Vashem is absolutely pertinent. It's important. There is a free search online if you're not aware of it. They have a central database of Shoah victims. So you can actually, if anyone died in your family, you can submit. You don't have to know everything about, them, just anything you know to honor them. But if you also want to research your family, or if you had family that remained behind, a lot of them are really, it's a good genealogical tool, because sometimes the dates and names of parents and children sometimes are on these pages, what they call pages of testimonies. And I actually helped a Holocaust survivor from Poland, a hidden child, using this database, because he had remembered a surname and he wasn't sure it was his, but I went in and I made trees out of all of the testimonies, and it certainly helped in the research. If you lift it up a little bit, the page, we could see there's Facebook groups. These are free. Okay, so we see Tracing the Tribe, Jewish Genealogy on Facebook. There's like over 50,000 members. You can you can post questions there. People are always willing to help, even help with research. Jewish Genealogy Portal is very similar to the first one. Genealogical translations, that's for if you have like documents of all different, like most documents that we have brought to America are in different languages. So there are people there willing to help out. Then we have like Jewish Ancestry in Ukraine. That's a fun group. It's a smaller group, but they were real fun. I was talking about Ukrainian Jewish foods, and it lit up, the page lit up. Jewish Ancestry in Poland, if you're interested in Poland. Belarus, Jewish Genealogy and Ancestral Travel. There's also a New York City genealogy. Okay, we could go to the second page. Okay, DNA. I love DNA. I think it's like really important in genealogical research. I also happen to help people who have unknown birth parents, or I've also helped a few Holocaust survivors who didn't know who they were. They were hidden as children. One in particular that I speak about, because he's the only one who has gone public with it. This helps when we had somebody tested, and DNA doesn't lie. So Ancestry DNA is my favorite when you're looking for an unknown relative. In order to see the associated, it's because it has associated family trees attached to your DNA matches. And when you see that, it helps you figure out which line they're on. You do need a subscription just to see the trees. You don't need one to test. But to see the trees associated. So they do offer often a free 2-week trial. And I tell everyone, well, if you don't want to buy a subscription, wait till your DNA matches are in. If they have the trial going on, get the 2 free week trial, and then look at your DNA matches and all their trees for free. 23andMe is also very popular. I would also recommend testing there, because you may have a high match sitting there. GEDmatch, Family Tree DNA, and MyHeritage, you can upload free to, and from other sites, so you have more DNA matches will come up. Going back to Facebook groups associated with DNA, and these are free. If you could just lift the page up a little bit. DNA detectives, this is the best kept secret. If you are looking for a mystery person in your family, this is a very large group, and this is where you go before you reach out to any of your DNA matches. If you get like a high match, or you're looking for an unknown birth parent, you want to check in with the people that are experienced before you reach out to your matches. DD social is people talk. There are different people with different situations, and they talk about the situations that DNA has led them to. DNA is not for everyone. If you're afraid of discovering a secret over 100 years in your family, then maybe it's not for you. But if you're looking for someone, this is what you do. Jewish DNA for genetic, genealogy, and family is run by Jennifer Mendelsohn. She's a Jewish genealogist, and she is the sister of Daniel Mendelsohn, who wrote The Lost, The Search for 6 of 6 million. And she and I do share a small amount of DNA, by the way. Other things to look at are historical newspapers. You do need a subscription, but you can sometimes find your ancestors in these, obituaries, birth announcements, marriage announcements, or just everyday life. If they did something interesting, or if it's a local paper, you may find out more about them. Newsbank obituaries, that's a library source online that for me is free with my library system. If you have a library card, go online and see what's available for free. If you type in your library number, what resources do they have that you can use? The Newsbank obituaries are really terrific when you're trying to put together trees and understand how people are related to other people. Then we have Find a Grave. I'm sure a lot of people have seen that. A lot of the graves, there are pictures of them and information on a website. And of course, then there's ellisisland.org, and that's a free site. You can purchase, if you want to purchase the records from them, but you can see them. You don't need to pay anything. And as a matter of fact, that's where I took the photograph of Sheila and my family's passenger record, right on Ellis Island's website. Some of the records are also on ancestry.com. So these are the main websites that I love to use, and I hope you do too.
Okay,
Sheila?
great. Thank you so much, Lisa. That was terrific. And I hope you've inspired us to go forward and find our own family's roots and do the research. Please let me know, send me an email, send me a text. Let me know if you're interested in another program with Lisa that would be more interactive, where we can talk about your family's roots. That would be great.
Sheila, did we had once mentioned, I actually love, it was your idea about bringing a relic from the town, like a Jewish item.
Yes,
I mean,
that would
I
be
went
great.
I found stuff from Stavish from my great grandma. I bet everybody here has something like important from their family. And that just sounds like so much fun. And it could be interactive to communicate with everybody.
Yes, that would be great. And I think I was telling Rachel or another group that one of the other organizations had a program like that where people brought artifacts as well as photographs and other information about their family history, and they called it Kvel and Tell. And Rachel thought we could plagiarize that name and use that. So we might do something like that. If people are interested, let's go for it. And I know, Lisa, you're generous in giving your time and information to us.
Yes.
And I think there are no more questions, although let's see, Rachel asked me if I was going to look up about all of the other families that were on the ship that brought my mom. And I maybe first I have to concentrate on my aunt. I've got to find out what ship she came on, because she was with my mother and my grandmother as they fled from Stavish. So we'll got to figure out what happened with her.
Absolutely.
So there's a lot more to do, and thank you for all the resources. So I guess Lisa, thank you for your time on behalf of
I just wanted to
Hadassah.
say, if
Yes.
anybody needs to contact me, I'm at lisabrahin@gmail.com. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to help you. I love mysteries. So it's lisabrahin@gmail.com. The book
Lisa,
is
put it in the
Tears
chat.
Over Russia.
Put your email in the chat.
Oh,
You could write
okay.
in the chat. It's easy, lisabrahin@gmail.com.
Yeah.
And you're very generous with your time. That's wonderful. And on behalf of Hadassah and the Federation, we're glad everybody came on the Zoom and braved the storm. And hopefully we'll see each other together in person next time. Let's hope. And until then, we're checking off. Thank you, Marcia, for Zooming us and helping us out with that, and everyone else who's part of this program. Good night.
Sheila, thank you. And thank you, everybody. Good
Good
night.
night, Lisa.
you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. It was great.
Bye-bye.
There's no chance to make a comment?
Yes,
Yeah.
who wants to comment? Yes, we can have comments.
Yes,
Right.
great. I have a comment. Lisa,
This-
before you leave, are you still there?
Yeah,
want-
I'm here, but I don't know who's
Comment.
talking. I can't
Oh,
see.
It's all right.
I was talking first, Linda Winkle.
All right, one at a time. Who's talking? I'm sorry.
Lisa, put yours on speaker view. If you go up to view and then click speaker,
Oh, okay.
and then
All
you'll know
right.
who's talking.
Okay,
Hi,
it's on.
this is Linda Winkleman calling. And I loved your book. As I was reading it, I was almost jumping out of my skin because I was born and raised in Rhode Island.
Mhm.
And a lot of the people I know, they came from that area, including my great-grandparents. And Charlie, I don't know if he was born in Fall River. Sheila would know. Was your cousin Charlie Basque born in?
Charlie is here. He can speak for himself. Charlie, unmute yourself. There
Hello,
you go.
hello,
Yeah,
Hello, we-
so
yes,
did you grow up in Fall River?
yes, absolutely.
Okay, so,
My mother was a Horvitz, Horvitz, like Sheila.
okay. So my great-grandmother was in Providence and 4 of her siblings were in Fall River. They were the Uditskis
I know Janice Uditsky went to school with me.
and the Dashoffs.
The Dashoffs, my father practiced law with Aaron Dashoff.
Okay, and the Loeffs.
The what?
The Loeffs, Loeff.
That doesn't ring a bell.
All right, so my great-grandmother's sister, Fega Uditsky, married a Loeth in the Ukraine, and they had a son and her husband died, and then she married Nissan Dashoff. So they settled in Fall River in 1902. The next year, her son, Ari Loeth, came into Fall River, and he was married to his first cousin, Catherine Loeth. Their first cousin, Olga, was married to Shalom Aleichem.
Oh my.
Right.
Oh, Olga Loyev.
Yeah,
I
so
Yeah,
I have
wow.
a question. I have
So-
two questions for Lisa.
Okay.
Lisa, first of all, this sounds terrific, and I'm going to read your book.
Thank you.
The first question is, are you a professional in the sense that I could hire you? Do you work for people, or?
I'm not doing that now, no, but I'd be happy to guide you
All
in
right,
any way that I can.
the other question is a little offbeat, but I'm sure you've been asked this before. I don't know a single person in the United States who today is rooting for Russia over Ukraine. On the other hand, there's like a little voice in the back of my mind that's saying, hey, those people weren't so great either. Does that go through your mind?
I've been asked that a lot, and I will say when I first saw the war break out and I saw all the women and children running, it brought back almost like memories of the stories my grandmother told, but it was the Jews at that time running. I look at it like 100 years has passed and they're a young country. And you notice there's a lot, most of the people living there are young people. There's not a lot of the older generation. And I personally don't believe that it's right to blame older generations, like from the past, the sins of the fathers or the ancestors. No, I believe that we should support them because they're being unfairly treated. They're running for their lives too, and they're not to blame for what happened 100 years.
And a quick question, my family from Ukraine left at about 1900 in stages. And obviously life wasn't so good over there, but would they have lived through pogroms like that in they were from Kupygorod near Shmerinka, sort of down near Moldova.
What country were they from?
Ukraine,
Ukraine?
near the city of Shmerinka,
Okay.
down toward Moldova.
Moldova. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, there were, I would say, well, throughout history, there were pogroms, but beginning around 1882, there were pogroms when the Tsar was assassinated because they blamed the Jews, which was unfair also. There were 3 rounds, that pogrom, and then in the early 1900s, we had more pogroms from 1903 to 1905. So Jews were also fleeing in that time period. They weren't as deadly as the 1917 and 1921 pogroms, but people were fleeing. The Jews were fleeing. So probably your family got caught up in the pogroms, and it was in that area. Yes, in Moldova.
I think my grandparents came in 1904, but some of them came
Yeah.
a few years earlier.
Yeah.
This is
They
terrific.
were-
I'm going to get your book.
Okay, great.
Definitely, as Lisa said, there were waves of pogroms, the 1880s, 1903 to 5, and the 1917. And as Lisa said, and as there's a great book called In the Midst of Civilization by, what's his name?
Jeffrey Weidlinger.
Jeffrey Weidlinger, that goes into I mean, Lisa has wonderful annotations and research in her book. It reads like a novel, but it's history, and she has a lot of footnotes and information. But Jeffrey Weidlinger has a very academic view of that period between 1917 and 1921, and talks about it as a prelude to the Holocaust. And as Lisa has said, it's very much underrepresented and not as much recognized because the Holocaust takes front stage in our minds about the tragedies of the Jewish people. But again, Lisa has talked about it, and I've read maybe 250,000 to 300,000 more Jews were killed during those years after the revolution that my family went through, that Lisa's family went through. And those that weren't killed were devastated with their houses torched and burned, and the terror that it left for the rest of their lives. So we don't really appreciate that period as being as significant as it was as a tragedy in Jewish history.
Yeah.
And the other important point that I think about is in 1923, when our ships came over to Ellis Island, that was pretty much the end of Ellis Island. In 1924,
Right.
the United States Congress passed laws restricting immigration from Eastern Europe. And many of our people in Stavisht and all the other towns, they were left to be destroyed by the Nazis. And the few that were remaining, I don't know how many were remaining in Stavisht in 1941 to 1943, much of those shtetls that had Jews left were totally wiped out, right, Lisa?
They were. In Stavisht, we had around 300 that were murdered. There is an appendix in the back of my book that covers the Holocaust in Stavisht. I found 1 survivor.
Wow.
Wow.
And by the way, Charlie, I was looking, just go on Google Maps. I went on Google Maps and I put in Stavisht and it comes up. And then I went and asked directions to Shmerinka, it's in there.
Shmerinka. Yeah.
ZH, and guess what? It's 200 and something kilometers away and a 3-hour trip. So we'll
Right.
have to take a car
And
trip.
by
there
the
one
way,
day.
not to monopolize this, but I sent you some pictures of my grandparents.
I have them
They
and we're
would
going to
fit.
use
They would
them.
fit right in with the pictures that she was showing.
Absolutely. And Charlie, I have your pictures and others who've sent me stuff, and we're going to use them. If we have another program, we're going to publish them and use them. So that's great.
Okay, I'm brushing up on my Russian that I studied in school for Shkola, and I got
Okay.
an app today that translates things automatically. I
All
see
right.
Vic.
And
Okay.
Rachel, I was telling you that our cousin Charlie, he was the political editor for the Providence Journal for many years, and Rachel is a Providence native. I think.
Yes, I'm
Right.
here right now in Providence, and I was
Right.
going to
Did-
play Jewish geography with Leah and Kenny.
Did you
Hurt.
say that you went to Brown?
Yes,
My wife and I both went to Brown,
excellent.
class of 66 and 67.
And my father, Paul Alexander, was class of 68.
Wow.
Right,
Oh.
yeah.
Wow,
Does
so we
anybody,
overlap.
yeah. Anybody else have a comment or a question?
I would-
As we,
I do, may I ask? I'm
sure,
the
Rona, go ahead.
Thank you. I wondered, Lisa, whether or not you've known in your research a man by the name of Neville Lamden, a cousin of mine from Israel who is who has been doing all sorts of family genealogy. Does that name sound familiar to you at
No,
all?
I'm sorry it doesn't, but I'm gonna look him up now.
Neville Lamden. He died last year, but
Oh,
he was the representative from Israel to the Vatican, mind you.
Oh, wow.
Martin and I visited the Vatican under his arm, walking through the Vatican with him as he greeted everybody there.
oh, wow.
He was a wonderful connection to my father's family, a cousin. My father came from Krasilov, which is southwest of Kiev, and was born in 1905, came, before he was 10 years old. And his family ended up on Delancey Street. There was a Silverstein's Deli,
Uh-huh.
which we have a picture of. Neville has done a wonderful book for our whole family through the International Family, which I'll have soon, and I can share with all of you. And there's a picture of the delicatessen with a sign that my family is very, very proud of, saying that women are invited to sit for lunch at their own table. In other words, women were not allowed to go into restaurants in New York City in
I
those
didn't
days
know that.
without a man.
Wow.
And he was one of the first, and there was the sign on the window, instead of talking about roast beef or corned beef hash or whatever talked about on windows, that's what his sign said.
Wow.
It
It
Thank
was
you.
wonderful to listen to you. I will also read the book, and we'll talk more eventually
Thank
with you.
you. Thank you.
Vic, you had something?
I did want to briefly say, Lisa, I thought that presentation was spectacular.
Thank you.
It was an absolutely mesmerizing 60 minutes or so.
Thank you so much. That means so much to me.
And you've hit a real point of interest, especially I know for me and for my cousin Charlie. We're always kicking ourselves when we see each other. Gee, we spent hundreds of hours with our grandparents. We never thought to delve into the machinations that they went through in the depth that you did. You actually were inspired to talk to your grandparents and to document everything and put it in the form of a historical novel that I understand is actually not fiction, but truth. So you've interviewed everybody. That's really amazing.
Thank
I
you.
had, as I said, hundreds of hours with my grandfather, with Charlie's grandfather. Every once in a while, my grandfather would give me a bit of information. I think it was similar to what happened to the World War II vets who came back and really didn't want to talk about it. It was so horrific. But he did tell me that the Cossacks came in. So those were the Tsar's thugs. This would be the late 1800s. And the implication was, oh, this isn't so good. So we're going to go to America and we're going to go through Romania. And I said, okay, that sounds great. Just go through Romania. Like what? A taxi came and picked you up and took you? No.
Horse and wagon.
Horse and wagon.
Horse and wagon. That's how my grandmother made it there.
Well,
And
they
then
had to
go
forge
through-
that river. They had to
Yeah.
forge the river.
And then there's
My
the
goodness.
river, and then the Romanians Romania wasn't like Hawaii. It was a foreign country, and there was anti-Semitism. Yet they made it through. But when they got here, it was strictly, this is America, and we're not looking back. In fact,
Right.
one of Charlie's uncles and my uncle, when the wall came down in 1990, I said, Uncle Morris, let's go back and we'll see where you live. And Uncle Morris says, Vicky, don't ever mention that again. We are never
He
doing that.
spat
We
on the
are in
floor.
America. Yeah,
Spat on the floor.
yeah.
Right, he spat on us
So-
now. That's,
Sheila, I
yeah,
just want to
Yes.
say something before people start going off, because I see we've lost like half the group. So
yeah.
before you go, could everybody please look in the chat? I put in save the dates for the upcoming things that are happening between now and the end of April. So if you could please look at that and make a note of it on your calendars, that would be great.
Okay, great.
Because I see people are
Yeah.
dropping off and I really want to make
Yeah.
sure
Well, I
people get the
understand,
dates.
yeah.
Well, yeah,
I
we're getting,
also want to point out, Lisa, that you didn't delve into it enough. It's in your book. Your grandmother told stories about what happened in Stavish, putting you to sleep as a kid, right?
That's
She
it. They
told
were-
you bedtime stories.
They were bedtime stories for sure. And she drew on stories from her own youth. And I was actually the same age as her in her stories. And really, they were the only ones that I really gravitated towards. And that's why she opened up to me. She didn't open up to my mother, who was a generation older. It was very painful and it was hard for her, but it did start with the bedtime stories. Absolutely. Thank you for pointing that out.
Okay,
well,
all right.
it-
Any,
it-
anybody
I
else
just-
have a comment?
I just have my last comment. It's great that you've brought this whole era to life for us.
Thank
and-
you.
And gives us great inspiration to maybe do a little bit more work ourselves on ancestry and some of the other sources that you have. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you for your comments.
Okay, and again, everybody, let me know, and I'll let Lisa know, but we're not gonna plan another program unless we get interest and you're willing to do a little bit of research on your past and collect those photographs and artifacts and information, and then we'll have another program. And maybe, I don't know if we could be in person, but at least part of it. Lisa lives in New Jersey and it's not easy for her to come up, but she's here and she's given so much generosity of her time and her information. So let's thank her again. And unless
And
there's another
Leslie was going to
comment-
say,
Right.
Leslie was going to say something.
Oh,
Only
Leslie,
that I second, we'd like to do more with you, Lisa. It was excellent.
Thank you.
Marcia.
Sheila,
Thank you so much.
yes,
Sheila,
Das Vidanya.
keep it hybrid, okay? If you want to have it in person, that's fine, but Carl and I are participating from 1,200 miles away.
absolutely.
No,
We're
we'll
gonna
keep
have
it
hy-
hybrid, Dan. We'll
Yeah,
keep it
I
hybrid,
think-
not to
I
worry.
think, Dan, all our programs in the future are going to be pretty much hybrid because we're learning that technology. Absolutely.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, yes. All right,
All right. So Sheila, my Lantzmen.
okay, Lantzmen together,
Lantzmen.
right? Everybody knows what that is, right?
Yes.
Come
No.
from the same,
From the same
shtetl,
shtetl.
the same
Ah.
shtetl. All right, everyone, good night.
Good night,
Mazel
everyone.
tov, everyone.
Thank you for your time.
This
Thank
was
you,
a
Lisa.
wonderful program.
Thank you for your
Bye.
time.
Bye.
Good night, everyone. I'm going to click
Good
off and
night.
it's going to shut you all down.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Marcia.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Marcia.
No
And
problem, Lisa. Great
Lisa, We'll
program.
be in touch. Take care.
All right. Sheila, thank you.
Night.
Okay.